Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMyFactory and welcome to this next video from the series called IdentiSphere Explorer. In this video, I would like to talk about B2C, B2B and multi-tenant applications with Microsoft Entra ID. As you probably know, I already have some videos related to those topics on my YouTube channel. However, I thought that it would be good to refresh some of the concepts and also to create one comprehensive video that explains all of those concepts. So this is why in this video, there is not only a theoretical overview of B2C, B2B, single-tenant and multi-tenant applications concepts, but also I share some practical demos. So let's start. Great, so let's start with the tenant concept. So what is Microsoft Entra ID tenant actually? So Microsoft Entra tenant is basically your own private space in Microsoft Cloud, where all your organization's users, applications, and settings live. And tenants allow an administrator to set policies on the users within the organization and the applications that the organization owns to meet their security and operational policies. So having said that, just to summarize, Microsoft Entra ID tenant is just a bucket that stores your users, your applications, settings, and policies. And now moving forward, there is a very important question when it comes to applications integrated with Microsoft Entra ID. Who can access an application? And this is the place where we start touching those different concepts and terms like B2C, B2B, single tenant, and multi-tenant. So when we architect an application that will be integrated with Microsoft Entra ID, we must decide who will be accessing it. Will it be the external user, consumer? Will it be an external partner our organization collaborates with? Will it be our organization's employee only? This is where we need to understand what is behind B2C, B2B, multi-tenant, and single-tenant concepts, basically. So moving forward, there are two primary tenant configurations that you should know. So there is Workforce Microsoft Entra ID tenant, which is intended to be used by internal users or workforce plus B2B guests, so partners that collaborate with your organization. And on the other side, we have external Microsoft Entra ID tenants, also called Microsoft Entra External ID, tailored for external users, customers. So this one is SIAM solution, so customer identity and access management solution. And that's very important, okay? So this is like very important distinct difference here. So we have the tenant for workforce and we have the tenant for external users. So moving forward, let's start with the workforce tenant. So default setup when you onboard Microsoft Cloud services like Azure, Intune, Microsoft 365. So basically, every time you configure like Azure Cloud, Intune, or you start using Microsoft 365 services, you're granted access, or to be more precise, Microsoft Entra ID Workforce Tenant is created for you. And it's designed for managing employees, applications, and internal resources. So Workforce Tenant is basically intended to be used by organizations to protect their internal resources. And obviously, Workforce Tenant supports B2B collaboration or business-to-business collaboration. So you can invite partners or guests into your Entra directory and grant them access to your corporate resources. And that's what we see in many cases, right? Where you, for instance, invite the partner to your organization so the partner can access your Azure resources, or for instance, to access some SharePoint pages because you want to collaborate with this partner. So basically, you invite such partner as a guest to your Microsoft Entra ID Workforce Tenant. And on the other side, we have this external tenant, right? Which is also called Microsoft Entra External ID. So it's tailored for external users and customers. So here we purely talk about customer identity and access management, which is different than typical identity and access management in workforce tenant. And it's separate tenant configured specifically for SIAM, separate user store. That's very important to remember. Like when you configure, when you create external tenant, that's a totally separate directory, the totally separate bucket for your users and your applications, policies, configurations. That's very important to remember. And many people are confused, like, hey, so is external ID a part of workforce tenant? No, like you have two types of tenants, workforce tenant and external tenant. And external tenant, basically you can use it to register consumer business applications, support self-service sign-up, and manage external users separately. So if you know that you have your applications that will be used by end users, consumers, and you don't want to store those user accounts in the same directory where you store your workforce accounts, like your employees, then it's a perfect scenario where you can use external tenant. Okay, so just to summarize, choose external ID in workforce tenant when. And you can be a little bit confused, like, wait, Daniel, but you said that there is workforce tenant and there is external tenant or customer tenant. That's right. But also Microsoft introduced this name called Microsoft Entra External ID, right? And Microsoft Entra External ID is either a set of features in workforce tenant, or it is also used to name this separate isolated tenant for external users. So when you hear Microsoft Entra External ID, be sure to verify if you talk about the set of features available in workforce tenant, or you talk about specifically a separate Microsoft Entra tenant for external users. That's very important. So choose external ID in workforce tenant when managing employees, internal partners, hybrid Active Directory integrations. You need full conditional access, device management, and governance. You planning tight integration with Microsoft 365 and enterprise applications, and you want to have predictable licensing per user model. Okay, so in this case, you can use set of features in workforce tenant, and this set of features is called external ID. But on the other side, you can choose Microsoft Entra External ID in external tenant. So you can choose to create this separate tenant for customers when you are building customer-facing applications, which will be used by external users, customers. And when you need social logins, branded sign-up pages, like a scalable customer identity and separate user store. That's super important. Like even if you enable some of the features of external ID in workforce tenant, those users that will actually use your applications, those users will land in the same directory where you have your employee accounts or your workforce accounts. So to avoid it, if you know that you need full isolation of users, then external ID in external tenant is recommended. So basically, Microsoft Entra External ID as separate tenant is recommended. And obviously, in case of external tenant, you want monthly active users based pricing and cloud native flexibility. So basically, when it comes to monthly active users, there is like a pricing. So if user authenticated at least once per month, this user is counted as a monthly active user. So it doesn't matter how often this user will authenticate per month, it counts as one monthly active user. Great. So now the thing is that you can also ask, hey, Daniel, what about Azure AD B2C or Azure Active Directory B2C? So effectively, May 1st, 2025, Azure AD external identities P1 and P2 will no longer be available to purchase for new customers, but current Azure AD B2C customers can continue using the product. This is the official information that we can find in Microsoft documentation. So basically, the thing is, just to make it simple, Azure AD B2C is deprecated service now, starting May 1st, 2025. So if you are watching this video after May, obviously, it means that Azure AD B2C is already deprecated. And here is another information from Microsoft. We will continue supporting Azure AD external identities, AD B2C, until at least May 2030. More information, including migration plans, will be made available. So in this case, just so you know, like you should not use Azure AD B2C anymore. You cannot do it even. And basically, it's deprecated now. So if you plan to use B2C solution, probably you should look into Microsoft Entra External ID or other SIAM solutions available on the market. Okay, so the thing is that we reach this point where we understand that we have two separate tenants that can be configured when it comes to Entra, like workforce tenant and external tenant. So now let's talk about B2C applications integrations. So how we integrate those applications in this external tenant, also called customer tenant. We have discussed external tenant and workforce tenant in theory, but obviously it's good to see it in practice. So let's do it now. So as you can see, I'm signed in to entra.microsoft.com, so Entra Admin Center. And here is my workforce tenant. So Tech My Factory for Workforce. So this is my tenant that I can use for my organization to manage users, to manage my employees, to secure applications that my organization owns, and set up different kinds of things like conditional access policies. And now the thing is that, as you remember, I mentioned that there are two types of tenants. So this workforce tenant and external tenant. And let me show you something. So in the Entra Admin Center, I will click Overview, Manage Tenants, and here I will click Create Tenant. And as you can see, this is the place where I can decide what kind of tenant I want to create. Will it be workforce tenant? So as you can see, securely manage your employees, internal resources, and external business collaborators, or whether it will be external tenant, so totally separate tenant, to add authentication to your external facing applications and securely manage consumer and business customers. So in this specific scenario, we have to make this decision. And now moving forward, as you remember, I mentioned that this external tenant is called Microsoft Entra External ID. And it can be either a set of features in the workforce tenant, or it can be this external separate tenant. So I will show those features first. So on the left side, as we can see, this is still my workforce tenant. So let me click home here. As you can see, I have home, and here I have external identities section. Okay, so as you can see, external identities, Tech My Factory for Workforce. So in this case, this is the place where I can configure different features under external identities in Workforce tenant. So in this case, for instance, I can enable user flows for my line of business applications, so applications I develop as organization, and I want to, for instance, enable sign up for the users that will be using those applications. So in this case, obviously, I can customize the look and feel of those pages, like login page, registration page. I can enable users to sign up or use Facebook or Google to sign in. And this will only work for the applications you develop in your organization. So you cannot enable user flows and external identities for Microsoft Teams, for instance, or SharePoint. Nothing like this. This is purely intended to be used with the applications that you develop in your organization and you own, actually. So as you can see here, under external identities, I still have my workforce tenant. So basically, we talk about external identities within workforce tenant. But on the other side, I mentioned that external ID is also the name for this external tenant, right? So now what I will do, let me switch to another tenant, which is called Tech My Factory for Customers, okay? So now I'm switching directories here, and now I'm authenticated, and now I have access to my consumer tenant, actually. So in this case, this is my separate, isolated tenant, which can be used to actually secure my customer-facing applications and solutions. So again, if here I expand Entra ID section, you still can see that external identities is there, but in this case, it's TechMine Factory for customers tenant right here. So it's very important. So again, the same set of features, but in this case, we talk about totally isolated tenant. And obviously here, under the user flows, I have those user flows configured here for my application. So sign up, sign in. And here I can decide, for instance, which identity providers can be used to sign up and sign in. So in this case, it's email with password, but I can also use email and one-time passcode. Here I can manage identity providers. So as you remember, I mentioned that you can also configure like Facebook or Google social providers or Apple in this specific scenario. And obviously there I have my applications registered in this specific tenant. So now we understand that when we talk about B2C, we talk about specifically this external tenant, because it's business to consumer or business to customer. It's more like business to consumer name. So in this case, when we talk about B2C, typically we talk about the fully isolated solution or Microsoft Entra external ID tenant, which we use to secure those customer-facing applications and solutions. And obviously, in this tenant, what I can do, I can obviously customize the look and feel. So as you can see, when I click custom branding and I will click edit, for instance, here, I can change the layout for the sign up, sign in pages. I can modify the sign-in form to add my logo and stuff like this. So in this case, I can just adjust it to the needs of my applications. So yeah, so right now let me show you how such integration looks from the application perspective. So here is my Blazor web application. It's integrated with Microsoft Entra External ID, with external tenant to be more precise. And as you can see, here is a login button. When I click it, I'm redirected to login page provided by Microsoft Entra External ID. Obviously, if I do not have account, I can create one. So this is what I was talking about. Like here, I can provide my email, then OTP code is sent to my email. I have to verify my email, then I can set the password, provide some additional required attributes, and then I'm registered as a customer and I can start using this customer-facing application. I've already created my account, so let me click back button, and here I will provide my email. I will click next button, and as you can see, I can provide my password. I'm authenticated successfully, and then I land in the application. And here is the greeting. Hello, Daniel. So now I can start using this application. And this specific user is obviously stored under my external tenant, right? So in this specific case, as you can see, I can adjust the look and feel of the login and registration pages. I can adjust the look and feel accordingly to my needs and accordingly to the look and feel of my web application here. And then I can secure my web app with this external ID tenant. So here we purely talk about B2C or business to consumer scenario, where we have external facing applications and solutions and we want to secure them with Microsoft Entra. So in such scenario, Microsoft Entra External ID as external tenant is the best option. All right, so let's move forward with other topics. Perfect. So now we understand that when it comes to Microsoft Entra, there are two types of tenants. Microsoft Entra ID tenant, workforce tenant, and there is also Microsoft Entra External ID, which is external tenant used for B2C or business to consumer scenarios. We also understand and know that Azure AD B2C is deprecated now. So it's time to talk about single and multi-tenant applications now. So when we register application in Microsoft Entra ID, we can decide who can sign in. Application can be either registered as single tenant or multi-tenant. An important thing is that single or multi-tenant applications is a concept used for applications registered in the workforce Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So when we talk about single multi-tenant applications, we typically talk about workforce Microsoft Entra ID tenant. Now moving forward, let's discuss single-tenant application registration. So all user and guest accounts in our Microsoft Entra ID directory can log into an application and access APIs if registered, right? So every time we want to integrate our application or our API with Microsoft Entra ID, we have to create an app registration in our Entra ID tenant. And when we create this app registration, basically, we can select supported account types. So who can use this application or access this API, as you can see on this slide. You can ask, hey Daniel, but in the external tenant, when I register application, I see exactly the same options. So does it mean that I can also use single tenant or multi-tenant applications in the external tenant, B2C tenant? No. Obviously, the thing is that this blade looks the same in both types of tenants, but in case of B2C tenant, so external tenant, Microsoft Entra External ID for customers, you always select accounts in this organizational directory only. All right. And then customers can register, can sign in, access applications, and access protected resources. So for B2C tenants, you only select the first option, accounts in this organizational directory only. Now, when it comes to workforce tenants and single tenant application registration, you also select this option. So accounts in this organizational directory only. And the thing is that this option is recommended if your target audience is internal to your organization. So basically, you have application that will be only used by your employees, by internal users of your organization. So now it's time to see it in practice. So let me present single tenant application demo. Okay, so here is my workforce Microsoft Entra ID tenant. And under app registrations, I can create new app registration, as you can see. So here I can provide the name of the application, and obviously under supported account types, I can decide who can use this application or access this API. Here, for now at least, we talk about web application, Blazor web application. And as you can see, I have actually 4 options. The first one is the one that I'm interested in. So accounts in this organizational directory only. It means that this application will be registered as single tenant application in this Microsoft Entra ID tenant. I've already registered it. So as you can see here, I have my demo application for Microsoft Entra ID, single tenant application. And as you can see here, under supported account types, you can find my organization only. So it means that only employees of my organization will be able to access this application. Great. So basically now let's see the users I have here. And in this case, let's focus on Ellen. So Ellen is basically the employee of TechMine Factory organization. And now Ellen would like to access this Blazor web application. So let's see the authentication experience for Ellen. So here is my Blazor application, single tenant web application, and it's secured with Microsoft Entra ID. So I click login button and I'm redirected to login page of my organization. As you can see, it's branded. So here is TechMine Factory logo at the top. There is also a custom background applied. And here is the place where Ellen can actually start authentication process. So Ellen is typing her email address and she's providing the password. And as we can see, there is permissions request sent. So this application would like to access your basic profile. So this is like a standard consent screen that we see in Microsoft Entra ID. And when Ellen click accept button, basically Ellen is authenticated, as you can see here. Hello, Ellen. And Ellen can start using this single tenant web application. Great. So now let's move forward. So now we understand that single tenant application can only be accessed by users in our Microsoft Entra ID workforce tenant. So now let's talk about multi-tenant applications. Multi-tenant applications are available to users in both their home tenant and other Microsoft Entra ID tenants. It means that users from external organizations that use Microsoft Entra ID as well will be able to log in and access the application. Now, when it comes to audience type, it's very important to discuss this concept when it comes to multi-tenant applications. So when configuring multi-tenant application, we can decide what will be the audience of such application. So we can target user accounts in any Microsoft Entra ID directory or accounts in any Microsoft Entra ID directory and personal accounts such as Outlook.com. So that's very important. If we look again at the registration blade here, we can see that for multi-tenant application registration, we can either select accounts in any organizational directory, but also what we can do, we can select accounts in any organizational directory, so multi-tenant application, and personal Microsoft accounts. And obviously there is this last option, personal Microsoft accounts only, but this is not the case here. So if we want to enable this application to be available for other people, other users from other Microsoft Entra ID tenants, we register these applications as multi-tenant, and we use option called accounts in any organizational directory. So any Microsoft Entra ID tenant, multi-tenant. If additionally we want to add support for personal Microsoft accounts, we select the third option. And now a couple of other things. All users and guests with a work or school account from Microsoft can use our application or access the API. This includes schools and businesses that use Microsoft 365. And this option is recommended if your target audience basically is business or educational customers, external users in general, right? So if you want to enable your application to be available to other people from other organizations so they can access it, then you register such application as multi-tenant application in Microsoft Entra ID tenant. Perfect. So now let's talk a little bit more about this third option. So accounts in any organizational directory and personal Microsoft accounts. So in this case, all users with work or school account or personal Microsoft account can use application or API. It includes schools or businesses that use Microsoft 365, as well as personal accounts that are used to sign in to services like Outlook. This option is recommended if we target the widest set of Microsoft accounts and plan to make application available for external users. So not only the corporate users, but also for external users, right? So in this case, we select accounts in any organizational directory and additionally personal Microsoft accounts. Great. So now when it comes to login or authentication experience, there are some important nuances, and I just want to mention this because it leads to many problems and just to confusion. So when we integrate our application with Microsoft Entra ID and we want this application to be single-tenant application, that's easy because for single-tenant application, we use login.microsoftonline.com/ and we provide the Microsoft Entra ID tenant ID. Right? So in this case, when user is redirected to authorized endpoint, basically to complete authentication on Entra side, we underneath use this login.microsoftonline.com/tenant ID URL. And it's simple, but when it comes to multi-tenant applications with only corporate account support, it's different. So in this case, we do not provide the tenant ID because obviously the user who will be accessing this application can be from another Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So in this case, we use another URL, which is login.microsoftonline.com/organizations. So then when user will try to access our multi-tenant application, Microsoft Entra ID using the domain of the account will detect to which tenant this user belongs to. And actually, user will be authenticated against the home tenant. So that's very important here. And also, if we decide that we want to support all the accounts, so, like not only corporate accounts, but also, like Microsoft accounts, then we use login.microsoftonline.com/common. So those are important. Differences here, and this leads to some confusion, especially for developers when integrating applications with Microsoft Entra ID when building multi-tenant applications with Microsoft Entra ID. Okay, so the last one obviously can be also used with corporate accounts only as well. So you can either use /organizations or /common, but again, I strongly recommend using /organizations. So the second option, if you only plan to create multi-tenant application that will be used only by corporate users from other Microsoft Entra ID tenants. So no Microsoft accounts support. Okay. And again, if you plan to use Microsoft accounts only, I just included this here just to avoid some confusion. So if you select to only support Microsoft accounts, so the last option under app registration section, then the login URL looks like this. So login.microsoftonline.com/consumers. So that's it basically. All right. So perfect. Now we understand some differences here. So I believe it's time to do a practical overview here. So now let's see how to register multi-tenant web application, and then what is the experience for users when they authenticate from their home tenant, and also what is the experience for the users from other Entra ID tenants. So here is Microsoft Entra Admin Center again, and new application registration blade. But this time, we are going to register multi-tenant application. So under supported account types, we have to select accounts in any organizational directory, any Microsoft Entra ID tenant, multi-tenant, right? So we want to enable access to this web application that we are registering to other users from other Microsoft Entra ID tenants. And I've already registered such an application. So as you can see, there is a demo application for Microsoft Entra ID, multi-tenant app. And under supported account types, I have multiple organizations. So in this case, people from other Entra ID tenants will be able to authenticate and access this application. However, there is one important thing about API permissions here, which I will explain later in this video. The thing is that when application is requesting specific permissions from Entra ID, some of those permissions need administrator consent. So basically, in Microsoft Entra ID, there is this concept of consents, and there is user consent and admin consent. So when application is asking to just access user profile, sign in user and read user profile, then user can accept the consent screen. So that's what we saw also in case of a single tenant application demo. But there is a set of permissions that require administrator consent. Like one of those permissions is files.read.all. So user cannot consent. Admin will need to consent in this specific case. So it's only about the users accessing our web application from other Microsoft Entra ID tenants. So it means that their administrator will have to consent, and then those users will have access to those applications published by our organization, and our organization will have access to specific resources in this external organization. But for now, let's not overcomplicate things, because as I mentioned, like I explain consents and permissions later in this video. So for now, we are going to just see how to authenticate users in our organization, and also how authentication looks like for the users from other Microsoft Entra ID tenants. So let's see the application now. So here is the web application, Blazor web app. And this application is registered as multi-tenant application in Microsoft Entra ID. So now let's sign in as Ellen first. So I will click login button. Here I'm selecting Ellen's account. I have to provide the password, and then Ellen is successfully authenticated. We can see the greeting, hello Ellen. Great. So now I will click logout button, and this time I will use user account from another Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So again, I'm clicking login button, but this time I click use another account, and here I'm using Daniel external account from division 815 tenant, as you can see. So I click next button, and then I have to provide the password again, and consent screen is displayed. That's what I mentioned here. So application would like to see your basic profile. And once I click accept button, I'm successfully authenticated, and now I can start using this application. Here is greeting, hello Daniel external. So this is how it works in context of multi-tenant applications. And one more thing, let me click logout button here to sign the user out and click login button again. As you can see, when it comes to URL here, we have login.microsoftonline.com/organizations. So in this case, we see that this is multi-tenant application. So in this case, instead of the specific tenant ID, as it was in case of a single tenant application, we have this login.microsoftonline.com/organizations endpoint. And this indicates that this application is multi-tenant application. Great. So now it's time to discover other topics related to multi-tenant and single-tenant applications in Microsoft Entra ID. So we already know that it doesn't matter which type of application we want to create, like multi-tenant application or single-tenant application, we have to create an app registration. So we reach this point where it's very important to explain the difference between app registration object and service principal object, okay? Because without this knowledge, you will not be able to properly understand what's going on underneath, especially when it comes to multi-tenant applications. So let's start with application registration. So the application registration or application object found under app registration section in Entra Admin Center serves as the template for configuring MS Graph and your API permissions, client secrets, branding, app roles, and more. These settings are stored in the app manifest. It defines how tokens are issued to access the application, which resources it can access, and what actions it can perform. Okay? So we define this template using app registration. And on the other side, we have service principal, which can be found under enterprise applications in Entra Admin Center. And service principal is a concrete instance of an application. Each application creates a corresponding service principal in every tenant where it's used. And that's very important, especially from multi-tenant applications perspective. So each application, once again, creates a corresponding service principal in every tenant where it's used. It means that even if you have your app registration in your Entra tenant, and this is a multi-tenant application, and it will be used by user in another tenant, it means that service principal will be also created in this user's Entra tenant. And service principal inherits properties from the application object and defines what the app can do in that tenant, who can access it, and which resources it can use. Okay, and the last thing, I believe it's good to mention it here. So similarly to a class in object-oriented programming, the application object has some properties that are then applied to all created service principals or application/object instances. So in the object-oriented programming, you define a class. This class can have different kinds of properties, fields, constructors, and then you can create a concrete instance of this class, which is object basically. So application registration is such class in object-oriented programming, and service principal is actually a concrete instance of the class. All right, so moving forward, let's look at multi-tenant application process. So we have the user, and user is trying to authenticate, access the application, right? So on the right side, we have two tenants. Home, developer's tenant. So this is basically the tenant, Microsoft Entra ID tenant, where developer defined the application. Okay, so this is where we have our app registration created in this developer's Entra tenant. I call it developer's Entra tenant because I want to distinguish it from the user's tenant actually. So on the other side below, we have user's tenant, okay? And as you probably noticed, in home developer's tenant, we have application, but in the user's tenant, we have service principal. So let's see what's happening when user is trying to authenticate using multi-tenant application. So obviously, when user clicks login button, user is redirected to organizations endpoint, as we saw before. And basically, user consents to application. So user sees this consent screen that we saw before, right? Like, hey, this application would like to access your basic profile, for instance, right? And when user consents to an application, then in user's tenant, service principal is created. Okay, so as you remember, I mentioned like application registration is this template, and the service principal is concrete instance of an application. So when user consents, then in the user's tenant, service principal is created. And obviously, you can say, hey, Daniel, so it doesn't mean that it doesn't require any involvement from administrator? No. Basically, the answer is it depends, because there are some permissions that do not require administrator involvement. Like, for instance, if the application would like to access just basic user profile, that's fine. But on the other side, if this application would like to access all the users' profiles in the tenant, then administrator consent is required. And we will learn more in this video about such situations, right? So in this case, we just talk about the simple scenario for now. So once user is authenticated, basically, then user is actually using a service principal underneath to authenticate. So it means that if we go to this user's tenant enterprise application section in Microsoft Entra ID, we will see service principal that was created for this application registration that was created in developer's tenant, right? So every time user is actually authenticating and consenting in the multi-tenant application, the service principal in the user's tenant is created. And obviously you can ask, hey, but what about the single tenant application? Does it work in the same way? Absolutely. It works exactly in the same way, like there is app registration, and for that app registration, there is service principal created. But the thing is that when you create an app registration using admin center, service principal is automatically created for app registration. So it's automated basically. So when you create app registration in your Entra ID tenant for single tenant app, basically the service principal is automatically created for you in your home tenant. That's the case here. But obviously in multi-tenant application world, it looks differently, because when we are defining app registration, we don't know which users from which tenants will use it, right? So we cannot instantly create service principals in those users' tenants. Okay, great. So let's move forward. So let's talk more about user consent. So here is the thing, like when user first time accesses the application, user must consent, grant permissions. And that's what we saw, right? Like there is this information displayed like, hey, this application would like to access your basic profile. Do you agree? And obviously, if user does not consent, it means that application will not be granted permissions and user is not authenticated and will not gain access to the app. But if user clicks accept button, then user grants permissions to specific application and user is authenticated and can start using such application. And if this is first time any user from this tenant accessing multi-tenant application, service principal is created in the user's tenant. That's very important, right? That's what I mentioned before. So when user is trying to access the application first time, so there is no service principal created in this user tenant yet. When user will consent, then Entra ID will automatically create service principal for the application in the user's tenant. That's very important. And again, you can ask, hey, what about the admin consent here? Obviously, it depends on the permissions type, because if this is a high privilege permission, then you will need admin consent. So administrator of this user's tenant will have to actually grant consent, and then a service principal will be created. But if this is just a basic access and application is just asking for the basic user profile access, user can consent, and then Entra will automatically create service principal for this multi-tenant app registration. Okay. And as I mentioned before, not all permissions can be consented by the user, like user read-write all permission, right? So you shouldn't allow even users to actually consent and grant permissions to applications to access some of those resources protected with Microsoft Entra ID, right? So in such scenarios, basically, there is admin approval needed. So it means that, for instance, if application is asking, hey, I want to, access all the user accounts in your tenant and their profiles, this is probably not something that user should consent to, right? It should be administrator of the tenant who is actually verifying this request, and if accepted, admin should provide approval, right? Like after the verification. So as we can see here on this slide, this is the screen that we will see if application is trying to gain access to some permissions that are now not allowed to be consented by the regular user in Entra ID. So in this case, we will see this window, hey, we need admin approval for that. So only administrator can grant permission. Once it's granted, again, service principal is created. Okay. So now, when it comes to user consent, obviously, it's not like there is some magic behind, right? Like we can configure that in Microsoft Entra ID. So in Entra ID, we can control when end users and group owners are allowed to grant consent to applications and when they will be required to request administrator review and approval. And as you can see here on this slide, basically, we have access to user consent settings in Microsoft Entra ID, and we can basically configure consent settings here. And the recommended one that you will see, which is quite new, at least at the moment of recording this video, is the third option here. So let Microsoft manage your consent settings. Automatically update your organization to Microsoft's current user consent guidelines. Okay, so in this case, if you select this, Microsoft will manage actually those permissions that require admin consent. So it's more secure, it's more managed, you don't have to worry, you don't have to group those permissions, validate them. You just allow Microsoft to actually manage it, and you can be sure that then your Entra ID is well protected when it comes to user consent. So if we said do not allow user consent, then only administrators will be able to consent, right? So if we select this first option that we can see on this slide, it means that nobody actually can consent and only administrator will be able to consent. So in this case, we just do not allow users to consent. Only administrator will be allowed to do it. Okay, and Microsoft recommends disabling future user consent operations to reduce the risk of exposing corporate data, right? So basically the thing is that and this is what we saw in the past, like because of the fact that user could consent to different permissions, uh, basically applications gained access to some of the resources, some data, and yeah, it's a high risk, right? Because for instance, if application will ask for the permission to actually get access to all user profiles in Entra ID tenant, this is probably not what we want to do, right? Like it's overprivileged. So that's why we have to be careful here, right? So it's very important to visit these user consent settings and make sure that we have the right config there. Okay. So I said Microsoft recommended settings, right? Before. So here is the thing, like this is what we can find in Microsoft documentation, right? So the setting label, let Microsoft manage your consent settings. The Microsoft Managed Policy will update with Microsoft latest recommended default consent settings. So you don't have to worry about it. And as you can see here, we have end users can consent for any user consentable delegated permissions except file read all, file read write all, sites read all, sites read write all, and additionally, as you can see under the note, starting at the end of October 2025, the Microsoft Managed Policy will be updated to require admin consent for the following MS Graph permissions, like mail read write, shared, chat read write. So as you can see, Microsoft is in charge of controlling those settings here. And this is the default for a new Microsoft Entra ID tenant, right? So every time you create a new Microsoft Entra ID tenant, basically Microsoft recommended settings will be selected. So Microsoft will manage those permissions for you. So now let's talk a little bit more about administrator consent. So as I mentioned before, there can be a situation where we need this admin consent. Like we as a user, we cannot consent. We need to ask administrator to consent. So users in Microsoft Entra ID can request admin consent. So as you can see on this slide, here we can enable this option so users can request admin consent to apps they are unable to consent to, right? And then we can actually indicate who can review admin consent requests. Will it be concrete user or will it be group? So as you can see here, reviewer type can be user, can be group, can be role, right? And obviously, we can also get email notifications, right? And we can set the expiration date for such requests. That's very important, right? And as I mentioned already, there are multiple settings we can configure here, right? So that's very important. So when user will see the screen like, hey, admin consent is required, we can actually enable this option to request admin consent. So user will be able to ask administrator like, hey, I need you to consent because I need access to this application, and then administrator will be notified. All right. So another thing which is actually very important: verified publishers. That's very important information. So starting from November 9th, 2020, any users will no longer be able to grant consent to newly registered multi-tenant applications without verified publishers, okay? So it means that, let's say that I'm creating multi-tenant application registration in my Entra ID tenant. It's not enough just to create app registration and just define some permissions. I need to also add my NPM ID to be verified, right? So then when a user will be seeing consent screen, actually, user will see under permissions requested that this application was published by verified publisher actually. So the organization who created this multi-tenant application, registered this multi-tenant application, was verified by Microsoft. Okay, that's very important. All right, so now it's time to discuss additional admin consent approaches. So when I say admin consent approaches, I mean the situation where actually admin can consent, can approve permissions, and obviously then the service principal is created in Entra ID tenant. So there are a couple of ways to do it. So for instance, there is admin consent endpoint, but also administrators can use PowerShell scripts. And this approach has one big benefit that we will talk about later, okay? But basically the thing is that if there is a multi-tenant application and we already know that this application will require permissions that only administrator can grant, the better way is just to ask administrator to consent, and then obviously service principal will be created for such multi-tenant application registration in the tenant, and then users will be able to access such application. And for that we can use either admin consent endpoint or PowerShell script. So let's talk about admin consent endpoint first, okay? So obviously this endpoint requires Microsoft Entra ID tenant administrator to use it, right? So the thing is that it's a URL that administrator can actually open in the browser, and then permissions request or consent screen, as we can see on this slide, will be displayed. Like, hey, this demo application for Microsoft Entra ID multi-tenant app would like to access, user profile and sign the user in, right? So user will see, or to be more precise, administrator will see such a consent screen, and then once accepted, a service principal will be created, and then users will be able to use this application. And this one provides easy to use experience, right? Because there is just an URL and basically administrator can open it in the browser, administrator can click accept, obviously after reviewing the permissions that were requested, and then a service principal is created for such multi-tenant application, and then users can start using such application. And this one can be used for multi-tenant applications and web APIs provisioning, so service principal creation. Again, as you remember, I mentioned that for each app registration, we need service principal to be created in Microsoft Entra ID tenant, and we can access those service principals under Enterprise Applications section in Microsoft Entra ID. So basically, in context of multi-tenant applications, admin consent endpoint can be used for multi-tenant applications and web APIs provisioning. So to create service principals, right? And this is very important. And we are going to discuss some scenarios later in this video. So here is the example of such a consent endpoint, as you can see here. So login.microsoftonline.com/obviously organization/admin consent. And here we have to also provide the client ID of multi-tenant application. Okay, and then if we open such URL in the browser, we will see the consent screen for the administrator, and once admin accepts those permissions that were requested, then service principal is created, and then users will be able to authenticate and access such multi-tenant application. All right. So just a couple of things, because obviously URL is the simplest way. But what we can do also in our application, we can provide such button like click here to admin consent, right, in your MS Entra ID tenant. So we can provide a button for the administrators to easily provision service principals in their home tenants. So basically, In this application, we can have such button, and then once administrator is authenticated, administrator will see the consent screen, can accept permissions, and then service principal will be created, and then users will be able to access such application. So that's one approach here. So we can create such button, and obviously such button will use this consent endpoint that I presented before. But obviously, like this button is one idea, but typically in the real world scenarios, instead of having such buttons or sending some URLs, we probably want to utilize, I would say, a more scripted approach. So in this case, we can utilize PowerShell script. So this one requires Microsoft Entra ID tenant administrator to use it. And basically, this can be used to provision service principals for applications and web APIs and daemons and service applications, whatever it is actually. This script can be used to create service principal in a Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So as you can see here, obviously we have to authenticate first as an administrator. We have to provide application ID, which is client ID of the app, and then we call new service principal here, commandlet. So in this case, service principal will be created in the tenant. So this approach is more typical to be used by administrators. So instead of using consent URL or consent endpoint, administrator can just utilize this simple PowerShell script, create service principals, and then again, users will be able to authenticate and access such an application, which is multi-tenant application. All right. So we reached the point where it's time to talk about API permissions and access concepts. Okay, so let's start with one important thing, just to clarify it. When we create app registration in Microsoft Entra ID tenant, this app registration can be for different kinds of applications. This can be for web application, for mobile application, single page application, lemon application, but also for the protected resource, which is an API. So here is the example. On the left side, we can see application registration for single-tenant API. So when we are registering an API under Expose an API tab in Microsoft Entra ID app registration blade, we have to provide application ID URI, which has to be unique in this Microsoft Entra ID tenant. And typically it's API dash and the client ID of this API. And that's fine. And obviously we have to define different scopes here, and then application can actually request an access token from Microsoft Entra ID during user authentication. All right. On the other side, we can register multi-tenant API in Microsoft Entra ID. Okay? But in this case, what's the difference actually? So as we can see right now on this slide, on the left side, we have application ID URI, which is in a specific format. It uses the client ID of our API. But on the right side, for multi-tenant API, we have a concrete format for this application ID URI, which includes the tenant name, right? So let's discuss those differences here. So application ID URI is one of the ways an application is identified when exposing specific scopes. The app ID URI for single-tenant applications must be globally unique within that tenant only. So that's why, as you can see on the right side, I can provide such format. And the only thing I have to worry about is that this application ID URI needs to be unique in this specific Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So let me get back to the previous slide here actually. So for my single tenant API, I just want to make sure that application ID URI is unique just in the boundary of my Entra ID tenant. That's it. So that's why I can have this format like API / and the client ID of my API. But when it comes to Multi-tenant API, in contrast, for multi-tenant applications and APIs to be more precise, it must be globally unique across all the tenants, which ensures that Microsoft Entra ID can find the app across all the tenants. So that's why here on the right side, we can see this example for multi-tenant API registration. And here, application ID URI contains my tenant name here, as you can see, right? And then we have this suffix like API/multi-tenant API, whatever it is. It can be also the client ID of this API, but the full ID URI has to be unique across all Microsoft Entra ID tenants. That's super important. So please remember about it. All right. So now moving forward, let's discuss expose an API section, right? So each API application registered in Microsoft Entra ID defines scopes. Okay, so on the right side, currently we can see how we can define and add new scope, right? So it can be, for instance, a file read, right? So it means that application will gain access to read the files owned by the user. So we can define different kinds of scopes actually. So scopes are defined to restrict access to data and functionality protected by the API, right? So when a user is authenticating, an application needs to access protected resource like API, application needs to ask user first, like, hey, I would like to access your files and your profile. Do you consent? Do you agree? And that's why we see this consent screen in Microsoft Entra ID, right? And once a user gives consent, then application receives an access token and then can call protected resource, which is the API with this access token. And then API can look into the token, can obviously validate it and check the scope or scopes, right? So which level of permissions was granted to the application where a user authenticated. All right. So once API scopes are exposed, we can specify access permissions for the applications that will call this API. Okay? So in this case, on the right side, we can see an application registration for single-tenant application, right? So this is what we can see on other side. So for the application that will be accessing specific register API. So in this case, we are opening API permissions tab to indicate which permissions can be requested or will be requested by the application. So this is the place where we can say, hey, this application will need permissions to access a Microsoft Graph API, but also we can define permissions for our API registrations that we created. So as you can see here, for instance, we have this TMF single-tenant API and documents read scope, right? So in this case, we are indicating that this single-tenant application will probably call Entra ID to receive an access token to call a specific API. So applications are authorized to call APIs when they are granted permissions by users and administrators. That's very important, right? In this specific video, we do not talk specifically about OAuth concepts, but important thing is that before an access token is returned from Entra ID, user or administrator consent is required, right? So for instance, user sees this consent screen like, hey, application would like to access your basic profile, but also this application would like to gain access to your files, for instance. And once user consents, then Entra will issue an access token for the application, so the application can call protected resource, which is API, on behalf of authenticated user. Okay, great. So now, important difference, okay? So API permissions list, there is one very important difference. So this is what we see under API permissions. So this is the minimum list of permissions people will have to consent for the application. Okay, so here we define the minimum number of permissions, like for instance, user.read. Okay, so in this case, we want to sign in user, and application would like to read user profile. So this is the minimum, this is actually the only permission that we know that this application will require. But obviously, there could be more, but this will always be will always be required, right? So it means that there can be more permissions, but what we see here, those permissions will be always required, right? So we know that application will always use user.read to authenticate user and read the profile, okay? But it doesn't mean that application cannot ask for more permissions that we don't see on this list here, right? So application can also ask for more permissions, and then user will have to consent again. Okay, that's very important. Okay, so now it's time to discuss possible scenarios for single-tenant applications and multi-tenant applications and APIs. Let's start with single-tenant application and web API scenario. So there is a user wants to access application, some functionalities, and on the right side we have user's tenant. So Microsoft Entra ID tenant, where this user is actually registered. So we talk about the workforce tenant here. So now the thing is that when user is authenticating, obviously we use login.microsoftonline.com/tenant ID URL, because in this specific scenario, we are authenticating user in the context of specific tenant. So again, here we talk about single tenant application, so we use specific tenant ID here. As you remember, I mentioned that for multi-tenant applications, we use login.microsoftonline.com/organizations. But in this case, we talk purely about single-tenant application. So we have an app registration in user's tenant, right? And in this specific scenario, we want this application to get access to protected resource, so the web API. So we register web API in this user's tenant as well. So in the end, we have two app registrations in Microsoft Entra ID Workforce tenant. We have application registration for the web application that user is using to access the data, but also we have an app registration for the web API. So now the thing is that underneath, for both applications, there are service principals created in user's tenant. So for applications, or the web application to be more precise, there is service principal created. But also for this web API or protected resource, we also have service principal created in the user's tenant. So now, moving forward, it's time to see it in action. So let's jump into demo. So here are my projects in Visual Studio. And as you can see, under Single Tenant Apps folder, I have Single Tenant API and also Single Tenant Web Application. So this one is Blazor Web Application, and this one is ASP.NET Core Web API, both written with .NET 9. And now the thing is that when I will be authenticating to web app, I want to also gain access to API to get some information. So under controllers here, I have this simple report controller. As you can see, it has authorize attribute here. So it means that I cannot access this controller without a valid access token, right? So in this case, I need to obtain an access token from Entra ID, and then I will be able to call this specific API. So in this case, let me launch the application and API, and let's see it from the user's perspective. So here is my Blazor web application, and again, this is single tenant application. So I click login button, and I'm redirected to authorized endpoint of Microsoft Entra ID. Important thing is that in the URL, you can see that I'm using login.microsoftonline.com/mytenantid. So this indicates that this is single tenant application. So here I have to provide credentials for Ellen, and here we are. consent screen. But this time, the situation is a bit different, okay? So as we can see, there is information that there are some permissions requested, but one of two apps, okay? So in this case, we talk about two applications actually. We talk about Blazor web application that is registered in Microsoft Entra ID tenant, but also we talk about the API application that is registered in the same Entra ID tenant. So having said that, we talk about the scenario where application would like to gain access to API on behalf of authenticated user. So it means that we want to authenticate user and return an ID token to web application, Blazor web application, so application knows who the user is. And additionally, we would like to return an access token so application can call protected resource, so the web API, to gain access to some data for this specific user. So in this specific scenario, as you can see, here we have the consent screen for demo application for Microsoft Entra ID single tenant, right? But this time, as we can see here, is the information that this application would like to gain access to demo API for Microsoft Entra ID single tenant on user's behalf. All right. So in this case, we know that this application would like to obtain an access token to call protected resource on behalf of authenticated user. And obviously there is information that additionally this app would like to gain access to basic user profile. That's what we saw before. So here we click next, and there is another consent screen, right? But please note that this time it's displayed for demo API for Microsoft Entra ID single tenant, right? And in this case, we also have to consent that we agree that this application will gain access to basic user profile. So once I click accept button, I'm successfully authenticated now. And what I can do, I can go to reports tab on the left side and display reports returned by the API that is secured with Microsoft Entra ID. So let's see it. So I display reports here, and there is a button, display financial report. So I click it, and as we can see, the report was downloaded successfully from my API. So now I have access to all the records, so I can review the data. Great, so now let's look into Entra Admin Center to check app registrations and service principals. So here is Microsoft Entra Admin Center, and let's go to app registrations. So as you remember, I mentioned that this is the place where we register new application objects, right? So in this case, as we can see, here is demo API for Microsoft Entra ID single tenant, right? So this is my web API that I register in Entra ID. Under expose an API, as you can see here, I have specific scope. Just to make it simple, I just use access as user scope, right? To just allow the app to access the API on behalf of authenticated user. But basically in practice, you should define different scopes like file read, file write, reports read, reports write. Those are the examples here. And once those specific scopes are defined, an API is exposed, as you can see, using this specific URI. So API // and here we have the client ID of my API. Now I can basically request an access token to access this API. So if I get back to app registrations also, here is my demo application for Microsoft Entra ID single tenant. So this is app registration for my Blazor web application, right? And here under API permissions, as you can see here, I don't have to declare the permission to access this specific web API. I could do it and I could grant admin consent, and this will lead to actually not having users to consent and to see the consent screen for web API, right? So in this case, what I could do, I could click add a permission, and here API is my organization uses, right? And here is my demo API for Microsoft Entra ID. And here is my scope, access as user, as we saw before. And if I add this permission and I will click grant admin consent for TechMine Factory for workforce, then it means that the consent screen will not be displayed for this API, because it means that administrator reviewed this application and users will not have to consent actually, and applications will still obtain an access token to call the protected resource. Okay, great. So now under enterprise applications, we can see service principals here. So let me expand this a little bit. As you can see here, I have my demo application for Microsoft Entra ID, single-tenant. So this is the service principal that was created for my application. But also, as you can see, here is demo API for Microsoft Entra ID single-tenant service principal. So having said that, those service principals were created along with app registrations. That's what I mentioned before in the video. Perfect. So now we understand how it looks like from single-tenant application and API perspective. But obviously in the multi-tenant application world, those concepts, those things will look a little bit different, but still service principals will need to be created in each tenant where application or API is used. And that's what we are going to learn about in the next couple of minutes. Okay, so now it's time to focus on multi-tenant application and web API. And in this scenario, both applications are registered in the same Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So we register our web application as multi-tenant application in our Entra ID tenant, and we register our web API as multi-tenant application in the same Entra ID tenant. So as before, we have the user. User is trying to access the application, and obviously user needs to authenticate first. And on the right side, in this scenario, as you can see, we have two Microsoft Entra ID tenants, because in this scenario, we talk about multi-tenant application and web API. So there is home developers tenant. So I use this name for the tenant where original application registrations are created. So the web application is registered and API is registered. So in this case, we talk about our Blazor web application and ASP.NET Core web API. So both app registrations are created in developers tenant, and those applications are multi-tenant applications. And below, we have users tenant. So this is separate Microsoft Entra ID tenant, and there we have this user account. So what will happen? So user obviously clicks login button, and application is and user is redirected to organizations endpoint this time. So we will not see the tenant ID anymore in the URL because of the fact that this is multi-tenant application. So we should use organizations endpoint. So there, obviously, once user is authenticated, user needs to consent to application and web API. So experience will be exactly the same, right? So in this specific scenario, user will see the consent screen for web API and for the web application. And important thing is, and that's crucial in this conversation, when it comes to web application, the service principal is automatically created once the user is authenticated and user consents. That's easy. So then automatically service principal is created in the user's tenant. Obviously under condition that there are no permissions requested that require admin consent. But in this scenario, as you can see, we talk about application and web API. So basically this application will try to obtain an access token for the protected resource, which is web API. But the thing is that there is no web API service principal created in user's tenant, right? Like if we purely talk about authentication, and consenting for the web app, that's easy because application service principal will be created automatically in user's tenant. That's it. Boom. We are done. But when we talk about the scenario where we have application and we have web API, it's more complicated because in this case, this web API, so protected resource, needs to be registered already in user's tenant. So actually, again, we have a couple of options here. The easiest one is to declare the client ID of the application in the web API manifest in Entra ID under non-client applications. So here we open web API manifest in Microsoft Entra ID. There is a section or property, to be more precise, called non-client applications. And there we are providing the client ID of our web application registered in the tenant. So this means that both service principals will be created when user consents. So there will be service principal created for the application, but also there will be service principal created for the web API. Okay, so that's very important. What will happen if we do not add this non-client applications property? Unfortunately, user will get error. Like there will be information displayed that there is no service principal for the web API in user's tenant. And obviously, another method to solve this problem is to use this PowerShell script I mentioned before, where user's tenant administrator actually is using this script to create service principal for both applications, so for application and web API. So then it's solved. But in case of a scenario where we want service principals to be created when user is accessing the application and user consents, then we have to use this non-client applications property. Let me show you one more thing here. If we look into official documentation provided by Microsoft, there is explanation for non-client applications attribute, right? And here we can read that it's used for bundling consent if you have a solution that contains two parts, a client app and a custom web API. If you enter the app of the client app into this value, the user will only have to consent once to the client app. Microsoft Entra will know that consenting to the client means implicitly consenting to the web API. It automatically provisions service principals for both the client ID and web API at the same time. Both the client and the web API must be registered in the same Entra ID tenant. Okay, that's very important. So both application registrations need to be in the same Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So it means that then service principals will be automatically created for both application and API. So now if we get back to our diagram, in the end, this is the situation, right? So user is authenticating, and in user's tenant, we have both service principals created. So then user can start using a multi-tenant application and also call a multi-tenant web API. And in the end, that's what I mentioned. And this is important. So multi-tenant web API service principal must be provisioned first as a resource that multi-tenant app will access. And next, application service principal must be provisioned, right? And we already discussed different approaches how we can provision both service principals. Okay, great. So now it's time to see how we can actually use a multi-tenant application, how we can authenticate and then gain access to multi-tenant web API. Let's start with Entra Admin Center. So as you can see here, this is my separate Microsoft Entra ID tenant, so division 815. Okay, if I go to enterprise applications, as you can see, there are no service principals registered here. Okay, so in this scenario, we are going to see what will happen if user from this tenant actually will try to sign in to multi-tenant application that was registered in another Microsoft Entra ID tenant, which was called TechMine Factory for Workforce. So let's see it. So here is my Blazor web application. This time is multi-tenant application, and this application will try to gain access to multi-tenant web API. So I click login button. Again, as we can see, I'm redirected to organizations endpoint. So this indicates that this is multi-tenant application. I'm providing my username here, and as we can see, it's Daniel external user from division 815 tenant. I click next button. I'm providing the password, and after that, boom, we getting this error. So the app is trying to access a service principal demo API for Microsoft Entra ID multi-tenant, as you can see, that your organization, division 815, lacks a service principal for. You see? So this is the error I was mentioning before. There is no service principal for this web API, so we will end up with this error. So how to solve this problem? So we can either use non-client application property, as I mentioned before, or what we can do, we can basically use the PowerShell script so our administrator can register service principals for both applications. So for my Blazor application and the API. So in this case, let's use the PowerShell script. So here is the PowerShell script that administrator needs to execute to register service principals for multi-tenant web application and multi-tenant web API. So as we can see, we have to authenticate first in context of our Microsoft Entra ID tenant. That's why we have to provide our Entra ID tenant ID. And also under application ID, we have to provide the client ID of a multi-tenant application and then multi-tenant web API. And in the end, we call new MG service principal commandlet. So let's create those service principals now. Once the script is executed successfully, we can see that demo application for Microsoft Entra ID multi-tenant was registered. I mean, service principal was created for this application in our Entra ID tenant. So now I will do the same for Web API, and then let's look into Entra Admin Center to just confirm that required service principals were created successfully. Perfect. So both service principals were successfully created with PowerShell script. Now let's jump into Entra Admin Center. So here is Enterprise Applications Blade, and we can see that both service principals were successfully registered for demo API, multi-tenant, and demo application, also multi-tenant. So now let's try to authenticate again as the user, and let's see if we can gain access to application and display report from the web API. So again, here is my Blazor multi-tenant application. I click login button. I'm redirected to authorized endpoint. Again, organizations endpoint, because this is multi-tenant application. I'm providing credentials. This time it's my user from division 815 tenant. I'm providing the password and I click sign in. But wait, I see this screen, need admin approval. Demo application for Microsoft Entra ID multi-tenant would like to access resources in your organization that only an admin can grant. So it means that potentially our application is requesting permissions that only administrator can actually grant. So let's look into Entra Admin Center again and let's validate application configuration. So this is the original app registration of demo application for Microsoft Entra ID multi-tenant app in TechMine Factory for Workforce tenant, right? So that's a separate tenant where this app registration was originally created. If we look under ABI permissions section, we can see that there is this one permission, files read all, right? So in this case, it means that we can read all the files that user can access, okay? And as you remember, I mentioned that because of the fact that we have specific configuration for user consents, some permissions will require admin consent, right? So here in Entra, if I go to user consent settings, as you can see, I have this last option selected. So let Microsoft manage your consent settings. If I click learn more and I open this link, we can see that actually here additional permissions are added, which require actually admin approval, right? So in this case, as we can see, end users can consent for any user consentable delegated permissions except, and here what we have, files that read that all. So when we get back here to our application registration, we can see that we have file read all, right? And file read all will require admin consent. So that's why user cannot consent. So it means that administrator in this other Entra ID tenant, which is division 815, will have to grant admin consent, and then users will be able to start using this multi-tenant application. So let's jump into this division 815 Entra admin center. Okay, so here we are, enterprise applications, so our service principals. Let's click Demo Application for Microsoft Entra ID, multi-tenant application, and let's go to Permissions. And under Permissions tab, we can grant admin consent for division tenant. So it means that we will accept all those permissions requests that we saw before. So for instance, for file read all. So I'm clicking Grant Admin Consent. And obviously here I have to authenticate again. And as we can see, consent screen is displayed, right? So here we have the information that demo application for Microsoft Entra ID multi-tenant app would like to access your files. So read all files that user can access, right? So this is this permission that requires admin approval. So I'm clicking accept button. And right now, consent is given by the administrator, right? So now, basically, users will be able to access this multi-tenant web application. So let's check it again. So I'm clicking login button once again. I'm using my account, Daniel External, from division 815. I'm providing the password, and now I'm successfully authenticated, right? And my application obtained an access token to actually call Microsoft Graph API to retrieve the files for the user. So that's one scenario. So now let's look into the configuration of the application to understand how actually this application is configured. So here is Visual Studio, and here is my web application, multi-tenant web application. Let's open appsettings.json file. We can see here that we have our client ID provided for this multi-tenant application. We also use organizations as authority because it's multi-tenant application. And under the scopes, as you can see, I have the basic scopes like OpenID, profile, offline access, but also I have this scope called files.read.all. So this is basically the permission to obtain an access token to call Microsoft Graph API to retrieve user files, right? To retrieve actually all the files on behalf of the authenticated user. And in this specific situation, this permission requires admin consent, as we saw before in this video. So that's why we need this admin consent so application can obtain an access token to call Microsoft Graph API. But there is one more interesting thing below, okay? So as we can see here, there is a scope to obtain an access token for the multi-tenant web application. And you can ask, hey, Daniel, so can we just use both scopes like files, read all, and also this scope for the API? Actually not, because we can only obtain one access token for one audience during the user authentication. We cannot get multiple access tokens during user authentication, right? So in this case, what I will do, I will basically comment out files that read that all permission, and I will leave this scope here to obtain an access token for the multi-tenant web API. So in this specific scenario now, let's open the application again and let's see what will happen when user tries to authenticate. Okay, so let's click login button again. I'm using my Daniel external account again. I'm providing the password, and this time, as we can see, admin approval is required again, right? Why? Because now this web application is trying to obtain an access token for multi-tenant web API. So actually, administrator must grant the consent to make it possible for application to obtain an access tokens for multi-tenant application. User cannot consent here, okay? So now we have two possible ways to solve this problem here and to grant the required permissions. We can either sign in as administrator here. So as you can see, I can click have an admin account, sign in with that account. And once I'm authenticated with administrator account, I can review the permissions and I can grant permissions. Or what I can do, I can modify the PowerShell script and add this known applications property in the script. So then actually I will not have to consent anymore. So it means that service principals will be created or updated, and then no admin consent will be required. But in this specific scenario, I want to show you how to do it using admin account, what will happen. So let me sign in with admin account now. I have to provide the password here again, like this. Okay. Oh, wrong password. So let me do it like this. Then MFA, obviously. So I'm providing the number in Authenticator app. And now I can see the consent screen. So what's happening here? We can see that demo application for Microsoft Entra ID, multi-tenant demo application, would like to access demo API for Microsoft Entra ID multi-tenant, right? So here is the thing, like this is the permission that administrator needs to accept, basically. So I can click next button. There is a next consent screen displayed. This is purely for multi-tenant API here, as you can see. And here I have this checkbox, consent on behalf of your organization. So it means that if I select this checkbox, users will not be bothered anymore with the consent screen. Actually, I'm saying, hey, as an administrator, I'm accepting those permissions, I'm approving them, I reviewed them, and I approve them here. So users will not have to go through the consent screen again. So if I click accept button, obviously here I'm authenticated as an administrator. Let me log out from the application. So I can use my standard user account. So I will click login button again. And here I want to use my standard Daniel external account. So let's use it now. So here is the email, then the password, and boom, no consent screen. I landed in the application. And here is the greeting, hello Daniel external. So it works as expected. So as I mentioned before, basically to make it work, when we have a multi-tenant web application and API, we need admin consent. So administrator will have to sign in and consent on behalf of organization. Or we can modify the PowerShell script to fill out this known applications property. And then actually when service principals are created, then the required permissions are granted. And then users can actually authenticate and access multi-tenant application, and also get information from the protected resource, which is the API. So here, if we click Reports tab and then display Financial Report, then we have access to the data returned from the multi-tenant API. Okay, great. So let's move forward. You can ask me, hey Daniel, but what about the situation where I want to actually limit access to my multi-tenant application? So I want to expose my application as multi-tenant app, but I don't want all the users from all the tenants get access to the application and also the protected resource, which is the API. So here in my Blazor web application configuration, let's start with that. As we can see in the configuration, in the code, if I scroll down, you can see here that under OpenID Connect settings, I have this property called token validation parameters here. And here I can define valid issuers. Okay, so in this case, I can say, hey, accept basically authentication requests from uh, those tenants. So to be more precise, accept ID tokens which were issued by the tenants with those identifiers here, right? So this is basically my division 815 tenant, and this one is TechMine Factory for workforce tenant. Okay, so in this case, if user is authenticating and user becomes from either division 815 or TechMine Factory for workforce tenants, then we will let the user in. But if this is the user from another tenant, obviously this will not work and user will get an error that he or she cannot access the application. Now, from the API perspective, situation looks in very similar way, actually. So if we open the configuration for Web API here, again, for the JWT barrier authentication here, and for this configuration, I'm also using token validation parameters, as you can see. And again, I can define valid issuers. So it means that when access token is sent to this API in the authorization header, there is a validation. So in this case, we are checking if the issuer is one of those tenants actually. So here in the code, I can decide whether to accept an access token that was issued by specific tenant or not. Okay, so there is no built-in feature in Entra Admin Center or in Entra in general that allows you to limit access to your multi-tenant applications and APIs. At least not at the moment of recording this video. So that's why if you want to limit such access, you have to do it through the source code of your application. Great. So now it's time to discuss some other also important and exciting things. Okay, so now we understand how we can register multi-tenant applications in the same tenant, but also there can be a situation, and it's very rare situation, I'm honest with you, where we have multi-tenant application and web API, but both apps are in different Microsoft Entra ID tenants. And now the rule is quite similar, right? So the only difference is that application and web API, those are registered in different Microsoft Entra ID tenants. So the thing is that in this specific scenario, right, we can talk about three tenants. So actually we have tenant one, which is developer one's tenant. We have tenant number two, which is another tenant where we have a web API application registration, and we have users tenant, right? So once again, in tenant number two, we have web API app registration created, okay? So in tenant two, there is our web API register. Now, the thing is that for the application that is registered in tenant one to communicate with this web API, we have to create service principal, okay? And the same we have to do for the users tenant, actually. So two service principals have to be created. One in the tenant one, developers one tenant, and the second one in the users tenant. Why? Because in tenant one, we have this app registration for our application that will be using this web API, right? So in this case, what we have to also do, we have to create service principal in user's tenant, as you can see. So in the end, we have this architecture, right? So in this case, in user's tenant, in the end, we have both service principals registered, one for the application and the second one for the web API. Okay, let's talk a little bit about best practices for multi-tenant applications. So first of all, test the application in a tenant that has configured conditional access policies, just to avoid some weird, like behavior situations during the authentication for users. Follow the least privilege principle actually. So, like make sure that your application only requests permissions it needs. Okay, that's very important. And provide appropriate names and descriptions for any permissions you expose as a part of your application. This helps users and administrators know what they are agreeing to when they attempt to use your app's APIs. Okay, so in this case, it's very important. So this is something what we will see on the consent screen. So, like be really descriptive about it, because then users or administrators will be confused. And try to use app roles instead of security groups. This can be unavailable in each tenant where service principal is provisioned. So if you use app roles, you can be sure that app roles will be available because those are specific to the application. But when you use security groups, not each Entra ID tenant has the same security groups created, right? Okay, so we reached this point where it's time to talk about B2B. So what is B2B feature in Microsoft Entra ID? So B2B, or business to business feature, is a collaboration feature within Microsoft Entra External ID that lets you invite guest users to collaborate with your organization. And now, as you remember, I mentioned that Microsoft Entra External ID is either the name for this external tenant for consumers, so separate tenant from your workforce tenant, or it's also used as a name for a set of features for B2B collaboration. So when we talk about B2B here, we talk about the workforce Microsoft Entra ID tenant. With B2B collaboration, you can securely share your company's applications and services with external users while maintaining control over your own corporate data. B2B works safely and securely with external partners, large or small, even if they don't have Microsoft Entra ID or an IT department. That's very important. So you can still invite those external users, collaborators, to work with you, even if such organization, such external organization or partner does not have Microsoft Entra ID tenant or IT department. So now moving forward, let's talk about B2B collaboration. Okay? So the whole thing is that when it comes to B2B, it's about inviting people from external world to our Microsoft Entra ID workforce tenant. Okay? And the user type for the B2B collaboration users is typically set to guests, and their user principal name contains the EXT identifier. Okay? That's how you can easily identify those B2B users within your corporate workforce Microsoft Entra ID tenant. Okay? So if you invite a user from external world to your Entra ID tenant to collaborate on some things, then such user will land as guest user in your workforce ID tenant. So now let's talk about some important facts related to B2B. There are no credentials associated with B2B collaboration users. Guest users authenticate with their home organization or identity provider, and then your organization checks the guest user's eligibility for actually B2B collaboration. So in this case, we actually don't manage the user account, or we don't manage user credentials in our Entra ID tenant, okay? And we use B2B collaboration when we actually need to let external users access our Office 365 applications, software as a service applications, and line of business applications. So those apps that we develop. And you can ask the question, okay, Daniel, but what about the situation where this external user actually doesn't use identity provider? Like, what about the situation if this user is using, let's say, a Hotmail account? So for such scenario, basically what will happen, Entra will send OTP code to such user's mailbox, and user will provide the code to complete the authentication. So the authentication will work even if the user doesn't have an identity provider or Entra ID, to be more precise. And if this user only has an email address, you can still invite this user to your tenant, and this user will use the OTP to authenticate instead of, like password. We can invite users to B2B collaboration using their Microsoft Entra ID accounts, obviously, Microsoft accounts, that's what I mentioned, like for instance Hotmail, or social identities like Google or Facebook. But there is one exception. When it comes to Google and Facebook, actually here, this will only work if we enable user flows for our line of business applications under external identities in our workforce tenant. Okay, so that's very important. Like in typical B2B collaboration, if we invite people as guest users, we have to do it as an administrators. Okay, so in this case, I will have to go to my Entra ID tenant. I will have to click invite user. I have to provide user email, and then user will be invited as guest user to my Entra ID tenant. But for scenarios where I want to actually enable external users to register themselves as guest users too in my tenant, I can enable user flows under external identities in my workforce Entra ID tenant. And then those users will be able to sign up and use, for instance, Google or Facebook, and then they will be able to access my line of business applications. Important thing is that this will only work, I mean user flows with external identities, so people can use Google or Facebook, if when we talk about our applications that we develop as an organization. This will not work for instance, Office 365 applications, okay? Or SaaS applications that we control in our Entra ID tenant, or access to SharePoint sites, okay? So basically, user flows under external identity section is intended to be used with applications that our organization develop. Okay, great. So again, that's what I mentioned. We can use self-service sign-up user flows to let external users sign up for applications themselves. Okay, but again, this will only work for the apps that we develop as an organization. This will not work, for instance, for SharePoint pages. So users can sign up and they can gain access and do different things. And the experience when it comes to sign up can be customized, okay, to allow sign up with a work, school, or social identity providers like Google or Facebook. And we can also collect information about the user during the sign-up process. So again, this is only for the user flows under external identities, okay? So when we invite the B2B guest user in our Entra ID tenant, we do not collect any details, right? There is no sign-up form. This sign-up form is only visible when we use user flows under external identities. And we will see it in the demo section in a minute. Okay, so now in contrast, let's talk a little bit more again about multi-tenant applications. So multi-tenant applications are available to users in both their home tenant and other Microsoft Entra ID tenants. Okay, so it's very important to understand the difference here between B2B access and multi-tenant applications. So when we create multi-tenant application, this application is available to other users from other Entra ID tenants. And it means that users from external organizations that use Microsoft Entra ID will be able to log in and access the application. So now you can ask, okay, So what is the difference then? B2B and multi-tenant application. What's going on here? Like in both scenarios, external users can access my apps. So what's going on here? So let's explain B2B access, I believe, because that's very important. Let's start with it. So when using B2B feature, we talk about single tenant application. Okay, so there is no like B2B app registration in Entra ID world. Like you literally create single tenant application in your tenant, and then obviously you can invite external user to your tenant and you can grant this user access to your single tenant application. So this user, this invited guest user, can access this application. And obviously, how you do it, like you can enable assignment for your application, you can use conditional access policies for that. But the thing is that still we talk about single tenant applications here for B2B scenarios. It means that it is much simpler to implement such an application, right? Because we don't have to worry about all those things like service principals, provisioning, and stuff like this. It's simple. It's our tenant actually. There is no additional effort to block guest external users, right? Because in this case, we can just go to the tenant and we have full visibility into who is accessing what. And for instance, we can block such a guest user account. We can remove such user from our tenant. So this user will not have access anymore to any of those applications. And B2B access is good when we have, a relatively small number of users, of guest users, right? So use B2B if you have a small number of people that you collaborate with, but always analyze the scenario, right? Because maybe on other side, it's better to develop your application in multi-tenant model, okay? And last thing, there is no need to provision service principal in any external Microsoft Entra ID tenant. Okay, that's what I mentioned. No messing up with service principals. Okay, but there are some disadvantages when it comes to B2B, and it means that it's better to use multi-tenant applications. So it can be challenging to manage a large amount of guest accounts in the Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So there is administrative effort increased, right? And basically there is no access to data stored in the guest user's home tenant using Microsoft Graph API. Okay, so in this case, once the guest user is invited to our tenant and user will gain access to different applications, it doesn't mean that we will gain access to full user profile and information stored in the user's home tenant. It will not work like this. User will be authenticated against the home tenant, but that's it. We don't have any visibility. We cannot use Graph API to actually pull some additional data related to this guest user. Licensing cost can increase, okay? So in the tenant where we have B2B access enabled, and when we add more and more and more those guest user accounts, the cost of licenses can dramatically increase. So that's why maybe it's better to use multi-tenant application, because as you remember in multi-tenant application world, this user will actually authenticate against user's tenant, and those applications will be registered in user's tenant. So you don't have to worry about this user account management, credentials, and accessing user profile, right? And in the end, user lifecycle management can be challenging when it comes to guest users and B2B feature, right? So in this case, again, maybe it's better to use multi-tenant application for such different scenarios. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the login experience, okay? So on the left side, we have single tenant slash a multi-tenant application login. That's what we saw during the demos, right? So we are opening the page. We can provide our corporate email, and then we can provide the password, and then we are authenticated. Obviously, consent screen is displayed before, but the thing is that there is no like sign up button or create one button, no account, nothing like this, okay? So on the left side, we see this experience for single and multi-tenant applications. On the right side, we have a B2B application login, when we use user flows under external identities. So when we enable user flows under external identities in our workforce Microsoft Entra ID tenant. Again, we talk about the corporate workforce Entra ID tenant here. So when we enable user flows, when the login page is displayed for our application, we see this no account, create one. Yeah, so in this case, external users will be able to create their accounts and they will land in our Entra tenant as guest user. Okay, so in this case, we talk about the B2B because as you remember, when we enable B2B feature with user flows, we still talk about single tenant application. Great. So before we jump into demo, it's very important to understand some differences in tokens actually issued when we implement those different scenarios like single tenant app, multi-tenant app, or B2B access. So let's start with an ID token that is issued for the B2B user. So once again, as you remember, when we talk about B2B, we talk about single tenant application. So once the B2B user is successfully authenticated, application receives an ID token from Microsoft Entra ID. And when we look into this ID token, we can see that there is issuer claim and also TID claim. Both of those claims contain tenant ID. But this is not the tenant ID of this B2B user, of course. This is our Entra ID tenant ID to be more precise, where we enable B2B or where we invited the user as guest user, okay? So in this case, under the issuer and under TID, we will see the tenant ID of our Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So now you can ask, okay, Daniel, so what about the scenario if I want to actually gain information about this guest user home tenant? Okay, so let's say that this B2B guest user was added from another Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So to check this user tenant ID, we have to look into the IDP claim. Okay, so in this specific scenario, under IDP claim, we can see actually the home tenant of this B2B guest user. But also, if this user use Facebook or Google, we will see the respective values. Like for instance, if this user authenticated using Facebook, then IDP will be set to Facebook actually. So that's the difference here. It's very important. Don't be actually surprised with that. Don't look in under the TID because you will see your home tenant ID. If you want to check B2B user homes tenant, look under the IDP claim. Or if you want to just check the authentication method that was used by the guest user, by B2B user, check the IDP claim. Okay, so now let's look into multi-tenant app ID token differences, okay? So here, there is also important thing. So for multi-tenant application under the issuer and a TID, we will just see the Entra ID tenant where user authenticated. As you remember, I mentioned that for multi-tenant applications, we have to provision those service principals, right? So in this case, when user is accessing such multi-tenant application, in the ID token under the issuer and under TID, we will see this user tenant ID, Entra ID tenant, basically. Okay, so now when it comes to access tokens, let's get back to a B2B scenario, okay? So when it comes to access token differences, first of all, under the issuer, again, we will see our Entra ID tenant ID where we invited this guest user. And under the TID, we will also see our tenant ID. So again, under IDP claim, we will see the information of the guest user home tenant, okay? Or the identity provider that was used to obtain an access token. So it can be Entra ID tenant, but also it can be, for instance, Facebook, if user flows are enabled under external identities in Entra ID. Okay, and on the other side, when we look into multi-tenant application access token, okay, we will see that under the issuer and under the TID, we have exactly the same value, which is actually user's home tenant where user authenticated. Because again, as you remember, in the context of multi-tenant application, we do not invite user as guest user to our tenant. We create app registration, we mark application as multi-tenant application that can be used by other users from other Entra ID tenants. And once service principal or principals are provisioned for those multi-tenant applications in those users' tenant, then users can authenticate and obviously access token will be returned, and in access token under issuer and TID claims we will see this user's home tenant ID. That's very important. So there is no IDP claim, as you can see, anymore. IDP claim is only presented in case of B2B scenario. Okay, great. So now it's time for practical overview. So let's discover B2B access to an application with Microsoft Entra ID. So here is my Blazor web application, and again, this is my single tenant application because, as you remember, I mentioned that we can just enable B2B collaboration for this application. If I click login button, I'm redirected to authorized endpoint. Obviously, we can see it's single tenant application. We have login.microsoftonline.com/the tenant ID here. So this indicates that this is single page application. And here I can actually authenticate using my corporate account from my workforce tenant. There is no option to sign up or just to create an account, as you can see. So this will only work if I will invite the user as guest user to my tenant. Okay, so in this case, what I have to do, I have to go to Entra Admin Center and click invite user. And once the user is invited to my tenant, this user will be able to access this application. Okay, but another scenario that I mentioned is where I can enable user flows under external identities feature in my Entra ID tenant. And then I can say, okay, I want those external users to be able to sign up and authenticate using their preferred methods. Like, for instance, either with Entra ID, another tenant I mean, or with Facebook or with Google. Okay? So here, let's see how this will work with a pure B2B invitation. So here, no user flows will be used for now. We will see how to use user flows in the second part of this demo. So here, obviously, I don't have any guest user invited yet. So I have to go to Admin Center and invite a B2B user. So let's see how to do it. So here is Entra Admin Center and my TechMine Factory for Workforce Entra ID tenant. I will go to Users, and here there is a new user tab, and I'm selecting Invite External User. Okay, so invite an external user to collaborate with your organization. And this is the place where I can provide the email of such user. So in this case, it's Daniel B2B user from another Entra ID tenant, which is called Division 815. And here I will provide the name. So this user will be called Daniel B2B, just for this demo purpose. And I will click Next. No assignments here. I will only provide again like Daniel B2B for first name, last name. No assignments here, just make it simple. So I click invite, okay? So in this case, I can invite this user as collaborator to my tenant, okay? So I click invite here, and now this B2B user is being invited to my tenant, okay? So now this B2B user will be able to authenticate and access the application from my tenant, this single tenant application. So let's move forward and see what will happen when user tries to authenticate. So here is the login page again. I'm providing email address of this B2B guest user. I click next button. I'm providing the password here and click sign in button. And here we are, consent screen again, we know that this will be this is expected actually. So this is a standard OAuth flow. So user needs to be informed that application will receive access to profile data, collect some log of your activity and stuff like this. So once I accept those permissions here, then obviously there is information that the demo application would like to access demo API, single tenant this time on the user behalf, right? So exactly the same consent screen flow as we saw before for just a standard workforce user in context of single page application, a single tenant application to be more precise. And we click next button, again, accept, and then boom, user is authenticated successfully. Here is the greeting, hello Daniel B2B, and user can start using this specific application, right? So then if user opens reports tab here and user clicks display financial report, then obviously report is displayed. And this is about the collaboration, right? So if I want external user to have access to those reports in my custom application, I can do it. I can invite this user as guest user in my Entra ID tenant, and then this user will gain access to this application. Perfect. So with this approach, with this B2B invitation flow, we can invite external users, collaborators, to actually gain access not only to applications that we develop in-house in our organization, like this one for this demo purpose, but also we can invite those people to access, for instance, Teams channels, SharePoint pages, and stuff like this. Okay? So now I would like to present how behavior will look like, how this behavior will change for authentication if I enable user flows under external identities for this application in my workforce Entra ID tenant. So let's see it. Okay, so a couple of things here. First of all, let's remove Daniel B2B from our tenant, okay? So what I will do, I will delete this user here, okay? And I will also permanently delete this user here, perfect, because now we want to see the scenario with user flows enabled. So again, this is my workforce tenant, just to be extremely clear about it. Like this is still my workforce tenant, but in this workforce tenant, I click external identities section, okay? As you remember, external identities can be used for both set of features in workforce Entra ID tenant, or it can be used for as a name for separate tenant for SIAM solutions, so for customers. So here in my workforce tenant, here, under external collaboration settings, actually here, as you can see, there is this option. Enable guest self-service sign-up via user flows, okay? So this basically can be enabled, and then users, external users I mean, will be able to sign up, register, and access our line of business applications. Important thing is that this feature will only work with the applications that are developed by our organization. Okay, that's super important. We cannot enable this feature so external users can sign up and then access SharePoint pages, for instance. This will not work. For that, we have to use pure B2B invitation flow. So I'm enabling user flows here. I click Save button, okay? So in this case, it's enabled, okay? And now what I have to do, I have to go to user flows. So basically the experience is very similar to what we can see in this external tenant of Microsoft Entra ID. And here there is a flow created already, as we can see. So here under identity provider, I can say, hey, enable users from other Entra ID directories to log in. But also there is email one-time passcode. That's what I said before. If the B2B user doesn't have Entra ID or identity provider, one-time passcode is sent to user's email. Obviously, if I click Manage Identity Providers, here I can enable more providers like Google, like Facebook, as you can see here. So now, if I enable this user flow, so let me get back here. Once this user flow is configured, obviously what I can do, I can add some attributes that will be collected during the sign up. So given name and surname, for instance, as you can see. What I can do, I can enable this user flow for specific application in my tenant. Okay? So we can see that currently this user flow is not assigned to any applications. I will click Add an application, and here I will select demo application like this. And here we want to use our single tenant application. Okay, that's very important. So I'm enabling this for my single tenant application. And now I can start using user flow. So it means that now external users can sign up and then gain access to my demo application. So I don't have to invite them to my tenant using the B2B invitation flow that we saw a couple of minutes back. Now those users will be able to sign up and gain access to the application. Okay, so let's open Blazor app and let's see the current experience when it comes to authentication. So again, here is my Blazor application, single tenant application, for which I enable user flows. I click login button, and now as we can see, we have different experience. There is no account, create one label. If I click create one, I have the possibility to sign up with GitHub account, or I can select sign up with email. Obviously, I could have more options like Facebook or Google if I enabled them. So I click sign up with email, and here I'm providing email address of my user from another Entra ID tenant. I click next button, and as we can see, I have to provide the password, because this is exactly the same experience as authenticating as regular user, right? So in this case, this user is signing up to gain access to this application. And because of the fact that this user is from another Entra ID tenant, this user needs to complete authentication process. So by providing email address and the password. So I click sign in, and here obviously there is information which permissions will be requested from TechMine Factory for Workforce Entra ID tenant for this user, right? So tenant would like to receive access to your profile data, collect and log your activity. So this is the standard consent screen for the new user in this model. Actually, I can click accept button. And as you remember, I mentioned that with user flows, we can also collect additional details during the signup. So here I can ask the user to provide first name, last name. Obviously, it's pre-filled from existing Entra ID tenant. But for instance, if this user is authenticating from some other identity providers and given name and surname is not filled out, user will have to provide those details. So in this case, I will keep it as Daniel B2B. I will click continue button, and obviously we will see the consent screen. So from there, experience is exactly the same. So we see the consent screens. Here we can accept permissions requested, and then we land in the application. So here is the greeting, hello Daniel B2B. Great. So that's the experience when we enable user flows. So the last thing to check, if we look under users in our Entra ID tenant, we can see that Daniel B2B user was added as guest user to this Entra ID tenant. That's it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did. If you would like to learn more about digital identity solutions and secure cloud application development, not only connected to Microsoft technology stack, I strongly encourage you to visit techminefactory.com. If you still have any questions, you can find contact details there as well. Thank you once again, and see you in the next videos.